students. Welcome to our English B class. In this lesson, we want to continue looking at the short story Blackout by Roger Mays. We're going to look at conflict and themes. I'm your teacher, Mrs. Carla Wilson John. Welcome. In our previous classes, we've been studying Roger Mays' Blackout by examining the elements of the short story individually. We've looked at setting, point of view, plot, and character. So that leaves us with one remaining element. And what would that element be? Theme. So that's what we will be working on through this lesson. In this story, our themes rest heavily on conflict. Some may even argue that conflict itself is the major theme in the story, and that all the other themes that we will discuss are just stems and branches of the major theme. The beautiful thing about English B, as I said in our previous lesson, is that answers are based on your analysis and interpretation of the facts provided, as long as you can give your evidence to support your answers. This means that as long as you provide logical reasoning and sound evidence based upon the text, exact words in the story, or events from the story, you will be marked correctly. So you have the option of using conflict as a theme or using it as the basis or core for any theme or all the themes that we will look at. Conflict. What is conflict? Conflict is a struggle between two opposing forces. In stories, issues arise. That is conflict. The whole essence of a good story is that there is a problem, an issue, and at the end, it is solved. The problem is what we term conflict. Now think about your favorite story, or even a movie. Was there a fight, a struggle? Was there an issue between two persons? Was there a war event, a shootout, a gunplay? Were there gangs? Was it a character fighting against another character, or a character with emotional internal struggles? Let's take, for instance, the wonderful story of Lion King. Was there a conflict in that story? Were there any issues, fights, struggles? Well, certainly. There were quite a few power struggles in Lion King, here and there. Can you remember? He had to fight with his own uncle, and he had to fight with himself, whether or not he was king. Which brings us to the types of conflicts. Now there are more, but for your level, let's look at these four. There's character versus character, one person against another. There's the character versus nature. Nature seems to be fighting against that character's intentions. There's character versus society, the fundamental issues or the fundamental teachings of society versus that character's thoughts and intents. Lastly, there's character versus self, internal struggles and questions. So let's identify conflict in Roger Mays' Blackout. In order for us to do that, we must refer to the plot. Do you remember what is a plot? A plot is all the events in a story. Thus, it is through the occurrences within the story we will be able to say how, where, why, and between whom there were oppositions. So we'll go through each type of conflict and I'll ask you whether or not that type is seen in the story. Character versus character. Did we see that kind of conflict in the story? Did one character have an issue with another character in Blackout? Definitely. The woman had an issue with the man. You should recall that the story gave a detailed description of the man's appearance. I mean, he was dressed in a shirt and pants, yes, but he had a look of hunger and unrest in his eyes, a slinking movement in his walk. But none of that was the problem. The problem rose when she became disconcerted, disturbed, or unsettled because of the man's skin color. According to the text, but the thing that struck her immediately was the fact that he was black. The other particulars scarcely made any impression at all against that. But that was just the foundation of her problem. That wasn't the big deal yet. The story was now getting started. The black man stepped up to her casually. She was not at all used to that, especially at night. Then he asked her for a light. This she had to give from her cigarette, which she was smoking since she didn't have a match. In her mind, it was a little too intimate of an act, so that was a big no-no. And this brings us to another type of conflict: character versus society. The male character brought a challenge to the woman, but he was not merely challenging the woman at this point. In him asking her to share a light, to stand on the street corner and have a discourse, to be there while she was there. He was challenging her entire fundamental teachings, principles, and traditions, the culture of her home, the US. He was opposing the norms of society. This black man standing on a street where a white woman was, talking to a white woman, asking this white woman for something, a smoke of her cigarette. Her cigarette would have to touch his cigarette. No, this was not acceptable. This was not allowed in her society. He was challenging this. In the text, we often see her referring to back home. For example, in her country, it is not every night that a white woman would be likely to be thus nonchalantly approached by a black man. He had to remind her that they were standing on the street. This is the street, lady. It's public. And thereafter, he says, this isn't America. I can see you're an American. In this country, there are only men and women. You'll learn about that if you stop here long enough. Was there any issue with the weather? No. So there was no man versus nature conflict happening here in the story, right? Was there any direct conflict with self? Did any character have to introspect or think about themselves being right or wrong? You may tell me that the woman felt foolish and bad in the story, as she should have. But there was no big pondering or self-loathing, what you call her hating on herself. For us to term it character versus character conflict, nah. While we were able to read some of her thoughts, there were no inner fights or struggles. And there was certainly no clear resolution or change of character, mind, or beliefs within her. So in the text, we can safely settle on there being two kinds of conflict. Those two are character versus character and character versus society. Let's discuss these two a little further. Character versus character. It is important to note that in English B, whenever you're giving a response, you must refer to the text, be it a story, poem, or play. You must be able to quote lines to back up whatever point you are making. So we're saying that there was conflict between two characters, an issue between them. Here are a few lines to support this. Still, she was not particular about giving him a light from the cigarette she was smoking. It may be stupid, but there was a suggestion of intimacy about such an act, simple as it was, that, call it you may, she could not accept offhand. There was a moment's hesitation on her part now, during which time the man's gaze never left her face. There was something of pride and a challenge in his look, and curiously mingled with that, something of quiet amusement too. My third evidence is he stood there looking at her with a cold speculation. 4, in a way it unnerved her. Not that she was frightened, but he made her uncomfortable. If he had said something rude, she would have preferred it. But instead, this quiet, contemptuous look. How dare he? The insolence! It's a good thing you're a woman, he said. And so with those lines, you are able to see that, these two people had a problem. There was an issue between the man and the woman. Hence, character versus character conflict. Now I'm going to give you some evidence to support my saying that there is character versus society conflict. There are not only two humans in opposition, but we must look deeper. We must take into context what is happening. We must take a look at the society at the time. You will realize that institutions and regions were also opposing each other. These persons were from two different societies, two different geographical locations. The culture of the West Indies was different from the culture of North America, specifically the US. The male character did not agree with the race code of the American society, and the female character could not comfortably relate to the Jamaican social customs. Here are the lines to support my statements. In her country, it was not every night that a white woman would be likely to be thus nonchalantly approached by a black man. There was enough novelty in all this to intrigue her. She seemed to remember that any sort of adventure could happen to you in one of these tropical islands of the West Indies. This would not do. She had no intention of standing at the street corner jawing with a black man. There was something indecent about that. Why didn't he move on? As though he could read her thoughts, he said, "This is the street, lady. It's public." Statement 3, in America, they lynched them for less than that, she thought. "This isn't America," he said. "I can see you're an American. In this country," of course he was talking about Jamaica, "in this country, there are only men and women. You'll learn about that if you stop here long enough." And she says, "So in this country, there are only men and women, eh?" His response, "That's right. So to speak, there's only you and me. Only there are hundreds of thousands of us. We seem to get along somehow without lynching and burnings and all that." So you see the differences in their societies? In Jamaica, in our West Indian culture, we don't have to lynch and burn people once we don't like them or we think that they're inferior to us. No, there's no such thing. So with all these references and quotes, that brings us to focus on the other themes in the story. Let's have a look. Themes. At the top of the list is racism. And on the basis of contrast, you can say there's racism versus equality. If we want to compare and contrast, racism versus equality. Respect versus offense. Tolerance versus prejudice. And prejudice, of course, would be an irrational attitude of hostility directed against an individual, a group, a race, or supposed characteristics. Being hostile to somebody just because. Fear, class, pride. All these are themes that were brought out in the story. There was a class discussion. There was an undertone of it whereby the white woman thought that she was in a higher class, not because of her gender, but because of her ethnicity, her being white while the man was black. And of course, in the US, there was a clear distinction of how they did things there. And she felt very boastful about it. She had pride. And so did the man, because he was not backing down in any sort of way. So here, we're at the end of our lesson. We've discussed conflict and themes. But before I allow you to go, we must summarize. In this lesson, we defined conflict. We said conflict is a major concept portrayed in the text. The two types of conflict in this story are character versus character and character versus society. Examples of themes are racism, equality, pride, and fear. I hope to see you next time, students, where we can have more fun learning together. So long for now. Bye-bye.